Jeff, let's start. I want to know, in your opinion, why did the US decide to confront Russia in Ukraine instead of negotiating? Why did the US decide to confront Russia?
Okay, that is a question that has been relevant for decades now. At the end, during World War II, the United States and Britain and the Soviet Union were all allies against primarily Nazi Germany, its allies, and Imperial Japan in the Pacific. But after World War II ended in 1945, the United States decided that, the elites, the leaders of the U.S. decided that they wanted to dominate as much of the world as possible. They did not want to exist equally with what they considered the communist country of USSR. So they immediately started to work with members of the German intelligence agencies and the Nazis, who had taken over much of Russia, and tried to reestablish the Nazi German spy network inside Ukraine, which was then part of the USSR, and Russia, the Soviet Union. And so they worked with the most right-wing groups in Russia that they possibly could find, and committed acts of sabotage in order to separate Ukraine from the USSR. That went on from 1946 or so all the way up to the present day. The CIA was very active in Ukraine, supporting Nazis, people who hated communism, who hated ethnic Russians. And that has just been a constant ever since World War II ended. In 2014, Victoria Nuland in the State Department and the CIA managed to get a color revolution going in Ukraine and managed to overthrow the neutral former president of Ukraine, which was by then an independent country, in order to turn it into a NATO base. So from 2014 until today, Ukraine has not had its own government. It has been a puppet government, totally under the control of the CIA, the U.S. State Department, the Pentagon, and groups of heavily armed Ukrainian Nazis, both in Ukraine and also in other countries such as the United States, Canada, Poland, various countries where there were a large number of Ukrainian expatriates. So the campaign to attack Russia or use Ukraine as a proxy state in order to weaken Russia, or previously the Soviet Union, has been a constant from pretty much the end of World War II for the last 75 years. It's a fundamentally imperialist project, and it has never had any moral or legal validity. But in 2014, the U.S. reached a point where they thought they could escalate, and that's what they did.
I see. And we see that NATO officials are so much in love with defeating Russia in Ukraine. How realistic is that?
It's not realistic at all. It's not possible. Ukraine, of course, is right on Russia's border. They don't have to ship weapons long distances across oceans. And it's right there, and it's well within Russia's, let's say, military capabilities to defeat anyone that's near enough to their own borders. Just as, for example, if China were to establish a naval base in Cuba, or if Russia and China together were to set up a military base in Cuba and install missiles there, for one thing, the United States government would go ballistic. They would have a fit, and they would demand that all the forces leave. If China and Russia didn't take its forces out, the United States would probably invade, attack those forces, attack those missiles, because they're a direct threat to U.S. national security. Well, the reverse is true also. A NATO-controlled Ukraine is a tremendous threat to the national security of all of Russia. The missiles that exist today are faster than they used to be, and Moscow, St. Petersburg, major Russian cities would be within only a few minutes, 6-7 minutes of flight time for these missiles. The Russians would have no way of knowing if they were nuclear armed missiles or not. So it was a tremendous threat to them. And they built up their military and their technologies such that it's impossible for any country to achieve a military victory near Russia or near China, for that matter.
And
there's no way that NATO and the United States can possibly win in Ukraine.
And we talk about the US, but why the international community has failed to avoid this war in Ukraine? Because this war has destroyed and is devastating Ukraine. And nobody in the West seems to care about Ukraine and Ukrainians. And talking about the peace talks, that seems to be the only viable solution to this war.
Well, the West, okay, so NATO countries, Western Europe, Canada, Australia, any country that has sent military aid to the puppet government in Kiev are largely under the control of Washington. They are not fully independent countries. They have been drawn into this United States proxy war against Russia. And they openly say, Washington openly says that the goal is to weaken Russia, weaken their military, weaken their economy, and thereby enable the Ukrainian government to recover all of the territory that it has recently lost in the past 13 months. There are many people in Western Europe, in the NATO countries, who are not in favor of this war. And they are trying to pressure their own governments to call it quits. So we see larger and larger demonstrations against the war in France, Germany, many countries. And I guess it just takes time for the anti-war movement in Europe to expand enough to become effective and to influence their own governments, which are very much under the control of Washington, unfortunately.
Considering, and you talk about what happened in Ukraine since 2014, we know that there was a deal between Russia and Ukraine, Minsk 1 and Minsk 2, and considering how France under François Hollande and Germany under Angela Merkel were playing a game to buy time for Ukraine to build up its military to confront Russia.
That's right.
And how difficult it could be negotiations between these countries, among these countries. It would be so much difficult, isn't it?
Well, I think the United States and all of the NATO governments, almost all of them, need to be overthrown by their own people. I think the current governments in Germany, France, and Washington are simply too committed to this idea of weakening Russia. That they'll have to be overthrown. They'll have to lose power and be replaced by other leaders who have an interest in peace, mutual security in Europe and elsewhere in the world.
And when you see what happened in that incident, in sabotage of Nord Stream pipeline, and you see Germany is totally silent, says nothing, simply nothing. How can it? Germany is not a small country. It's a big country. Its economy, it's so big in Europe. It's one of the biggest in Europe. When Germany is like this, how we can think of Romania, those small countries, economically? How I was thinking how they gonna act, how they gonna say no to the U.S. in NATO, because it seems U.S. dictates everything to these countries.
Well, that situation doesn't have to exist forever. Any NATO country with the political will could quit NATO today or tomorrow. And I think we'll begin to see countries such as Germany deciding that they're not benefiting at all from this ongoing war, proxy war against Russia. At some point, either their government will fall or they will somehow insist that Germany stop cooperating with the United States in this proxy war. It's a matter of political will and the balance of power in each country.
And I'm quoting Julian Assange. He said he said every war in the last 50 years started with media lies. People are not in favor of wars. They don't like wars. They have to be fooled into wars. How do you see the role of mainstream media in this war in Ukraine?
Well, since February of 2022, mainstream media in the West, namely United States and Britain, but also many other Western countries, it's been the worst, most one-sided, biased, anti-Russian propaganda that I have ever experienced in my life. I'm 66 years old, and I've never seen propaganda this bad as what I see every single day in my own local newspaper in Lexington, Kentucky, and in the national press, TV news, New York Times, Washington Post, all of the TV stations. I guess Fox News is slightly less hawkish against Russia, but they're slightly more hawkish against China, it seems. And this is the worst propaganda campaign I've ever lived through.
And it seems that it doesn't matter for us that we see the United States from the outside. It seems that it doesn't matter if you get a Republican or a Democrat president. When it comes to the US foreign policy, the neocons' point of view is dominant. Why are they so dominant in the United States?
Why is it so dominant?
Yeah, why they're so dominant? Their point of view is so dominant when it comes to the US foreign policy.
That's an excellent question. I agree totally with your description. Both parties have been taken over by the neocon ideology, which basically says the United States has the right and in fact the obligation to intervene in any country in the world, even if it's a nuclear weapons power like Russia or China, to impose U.S. control. How do they do it? I think you need to realize that our mass media are all for-profit corporations, and as such, they have become under the control of the ruling class, which I consider to include all of America's billionaires, super rich individuals, the corporate sector, especially the military-industrial complex and other major powerful industries, and the intelligence services. So the CIA now controls or has a tremendous amount of influence over all of our huge, 5 or 6 huge mainstream media corporations. So Americans are being told only one side of the story, the imperialist, elite pro-war side, the anti-Russian side, anti-Chinese side, and people in Congress do not seem to feel the need to get information from other sources, such as the anti-war press, the alternative media, alternative information from websites, which I depend on every day to find out what's actually going on. Congress seems not to care or know about these alternative sources of accurate information. So the entire system is simply being influenced by the ruling class.
And when we look at the U.S. national security strategy, we see that its core is that it's dividing the world it's dividing in democracies and autocracies. And it seems that the role of the United States in the last 23 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union was this. They were trying to topple the regimes. They were doing revolutions in other countries. My question is democracy home ground or can be imported or exported?
Well, the United States today has very little democracy to export. We don't have it here. If the entire mass media is controlled by the imperialists, by the neocons, it's impossible for voters to know enough accurate information to vote for peace candidates, for example, or anti-imperialist candidates. They just don't know that other options exist. So we don't have democracy here. We don't have, what we have is an oligopoly by the military, industrial, intelligence, media complex. To talk about the United States or Britain exporting democracy is a bad joke.
And when we see these countries, specifically when we look at the Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, when you see the images from before the invasion, after the invasion, it's unbelievable. These countries has been destroyed. And do you think that the multipolarity would be beneficial to the world?
Multipolarity, I think, is the trend. And I don't see any way that the West can stop other poles of power from arising in the world. It's already happened. One could say that Russia and China together represent a second pole of power, and India and many countries in Africa and Asia, formerly the non-aligned movement, represent perhaps a third pole. I don't see any way that the United States can recover its dominance that it had from 1946 through perhaps the year 2000. We will never be the only superpower again, and I think that's a good thing.
And do you think that there would be a substantial change in the U.S. foreign policy, considering what's going on between Russia and China?
I hope so. I don't know if it'll happen. It seems to me there are three possible outcomes. One, the ruling class in the United States could decide that they're losing, they'll never have their power again, and they could start a nuclear war. That could, that could wipe out all human life on Earth. That's the worst option. Another option is a continued separation between 15% of the world's population in the West and 85% of the population in the rest of the world, where the economies just separate from each other, trade is greatly reduced, and the West enters a period of long-term economic stagnation, another Great Depression, while 85% of the world's people develop economically and live in peace. The third possibility is what you said, a change of leadership, change of power in the West, whereby we would start to cooperate with Russia, China, and all the other countries in the world. Stop trying to dominate them politically, militarily, and economically, and just coexist like a normal country. That, to me, would be the best case.
And the last question would be, what would be the end game of the United States in Ukraine?
Oh, we'll have to get out. We'll have to recognize that NATO has been totally defeated, and we're just going to have to leave. The sooner we do that, the fewer lives will be lost in Ukraine, the sooner the war will end, and the sooner reconstruction can begin under the leadership of Russia in Ukraine. That is the inevitable end game, and the only question is how long will Washington try to drag it out and prevent it from happening, or delay the inevitable.
I see. Thank you so much, Jeff, for being with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for asking me to talk with you.
Thank you so much for being with us. See you later, Jeff.